London, October 23, 1441. Dawn breaks cold over the cobblestone streets as Eleanor Cobham, Duchess of Gloucester, is dragged from her bed by armed guards. She doesn't scream. She already knows that screaming won't help. Within the hour, she'll be paraded through the city in her nightclothes, mud and blood streaking her face as the crowd hurls stones and rotting vegetables at a woman who once commanded their respect. By nightfall, she'll disappear behind the ancient walls of the Tower of London, and the woman who emerges months later will barely resemble a human being at all. What happened to Eleanor and thousands of women like her wasn't just punishment. It was systematic erasure, a calculated destruction of the female spirit through methods so brutal that most historical records refuse to describe them in detail. Today, you're going to discover what really happened behind those stone walls, and I promise you, this isn't the sanitized version they taught you in school. The nightmare began long before a woman ever reached her cell. Medieval authorities understood that breaking someone starts with humiliation, and they perfected the art into something resembling theater. When guards came for Marjorie Jardine on July 12, 1441, accused of witchcraft and conspiracy, they didn't simply arrest her. They tore her from her home at dawn, ripped the clothes from her body, and forced her to walk nearly naked through London's busiest streets while town criers announced her supposed crimes to jeering crowds. This wasn't chaos, this was policy. Medieval law actually specified that accused women should be paraded through populated areas to maximize shame and serve as living warnings to any other woman who might dare step outside her prescribed role in society. Children were encouraged to throw stones. Merchants abandoned their stalls to spit and curse. The physical violence was expected, even celebrated, as part of the spectacle. Eleanor Cobham's arrest reveals just how calculated this process truly was. As one of England's most powerful noblewomen, married to the Duke of Gloucester, and second in line to the throne, Eleanor had lived in luxury that most people couldn't imagine. When accusations of witchcraft surfaced, likely fabricated by political rivals seeking to eliminate the Duke's influence, her arrest was choreographed specifically to maximize her fall from grace. The guards who seized her on that October morning had explicit instructions to strip her of every symbol of status before she reached the tower. They tore the jewels from her throat, shredded her silk gown, and forced her bare feet onto London's filthiest streets. Witnesses described how she stumbled and fell repeatedly in the muck, while her captors laughed and deliberately kicked her legs out from under her when she tried to stand. The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. By the time those massive iron gates closed behind her, the proud Duchess had been reduced to something that barely remembered it had once been human. But the public degradation was merely preparation for what awaited inside. The intake process at medieval prisons was designed as the final step in stripping away a woman's humanity. What authorities called examination was actually systematic violation disguised as security procedure. Women were forced to strip completely while male guards conducted invasive searches that had absolutely nothing to do with finding hidden weapons. These inspections were performed in front of other prisoners and guards, maximizing humiliation and establishing the fundamental truth of prison life. Your body no longer belongs to you. Then came the head shaving, performed with dull blades that cut and tore as much as they shaved. Hair was considered a woman's crown, her primary symbol of beauty and femininity. Hacking it away was symbolic destruction designed to make women feel less than human, less than female, less than anything worth protecting. The clothing they received afterward completed the transformation, rough sackcloth garments deliberately sized wrong to create awkward, undignified appearances. But perhaps most psychologically devastating was how guards forced women to thank them for this treatment, to express gratitude for being allowed to live, to beg for basic necessities like water or a place to sleep. This forced gratitude created a kind of mental breaking that made future resistance nearly impossible. If you're finding this glimpse into history's darkest corners as compelling as it is disturbing, consider subscribing to this channel. These are the stories that don't make it into textbooks, the truths that shaped our world in ways we're only beginning to understand. Your subscription helps ensure these forgotten voices continue to be heard, and together we can shine light into the corners of history that powerful people once hoped would stay dark forever. The architecture of medieval prisons was itself a weapon designed to break spirits before any formal torture began. Eleanor Cobham found herself in a cell 8 feet by 6 feet in the lowest levels of the tower, a space deliberately sized to prevent comfortable movement while providing just enough room to avoid immediate death. The walls were 3 feet thick, not just for security but to create the psychological sense of being buried alive, separated from the world by an impossible barrier of stone. The window, if you could call it that, was positioned too high to see anything but a small patch of sky, just enough to remind prisoners that life continued somewhere beyond their reach. The cell had no sanitation facilities. Women were forced to relieve themselves in the same space where they slept and ate, a calculated degradation designed to reduce them to animal status in their own minds. The smell alone was enough to induce constant nausea, but the psychological impact of living in your own filth, of losing that most basic human dignity, was exactly what the system intended. What passed for food in medieval prisons was another instrument of control dressed up as basic care. The official ration for female prisoners was 1 pound of bread and 1 pint of water per day. but official records and actual practice existed in completely different realities. What Eleanor Cobham and other imprisoned women actually received were moldy scraps, delivered irregularly to maximize hunger and desperation. The bread, when it came, was often crawling with insects or contaminated with rat droppings. The water came from wells deliberately positioned near waste disposal areas, contaminated with the very filth that created the diseases sweeping through the prison. This wasn't negligence. Contemporary records from prison administrators show they understood exactly what they were doing, noting which water sources produced the highest rates of dysentery and fever, information they used not to improve conditions but to refine their methods of breaking prisoners through systematic deprivation. The mixing of male and female prisoners created perhaps the most nightmarish aspect of daily prison life. Despite claims of space constraints, surviving administrative documents reveal this was actually calculated policy. Guards at Newgate Prison in London openly acknowledged in records from 1450 that housing women with violent male criminals was considered additional punishment for females who had violated social norms. The result was a predatory ecosystem where physically stronger male prisoners could claim women as property. And guards not only allowed this but actively facilitated it. Women had no protection from assault and no recourse when violence occurred, because the violence was considered part of their sentence. Guards sometimes sold access to particular women to male prisoners who could afford bribes, creating an internal economy of exploitation that supplemented their regular wages. Pregnant women faced conditions so horrific that the mind struggles to accept them as real, yet multiple sources confirm these practices across different prisons and decades. Rather than receiving additional care, pregnant prisoners were often shackled more heavily to prevent escape attempts motivated by maternal desperation. Women gave birth in the same filthy chambers where they were housed, with no medical attention and no clean materials for delivery. Survival rates for these newborns were catastrophically low, most dying within hours from infection or exposure to the toxic prison environment. But what came next reveals the true depths of medieval cruelty. Authorities required mothers to continue carrying the corpses until official removal, which could take days or even weeks depending on the whims of administrators. This forced contact with decomposing infant remains created psychological trauma that drove many women into complete madness, their screams echoing through stone corridors as they clutched the tiny bodies they were forbidden to bury. The economic system governing prison life was engineered to extract every possible resource from prisoners and their families while providing minimal relief in return. Basic necessities like clean water, edible food, or medical attention were sold as luxuries at prices calculated to bankrupt families. Guards supplemented their incomes through these internal economies, and surviving account books from the Tower of London show the systematic nature of this exploitation. A cup of clean water might cost a week's wages for a laborer. A blanket during winter could cost a month's income. Medical attention for a dying relative might require selling your home. Families who couldn't afford these fees watched their loved ones slowly deteriorate and die. Families who could pay often bankrupted themselves trying to keep prisoners alive, only to discover that guards would continuously invent new fees and requirements, the system designed to extract maximum wealth while providing minimum relief until families had nothing left to give. Disease moved through these populations like divine punishment, though there was nothing divine about the deliberate negligence that enabled it. Typhus, dysentery, scurvy, and various fevers swept through female quarters in waves that could kill half the prison population in a matter of weeks. Yet authorities made no effort to prevent or treat these outbreaks. Instead, epidemics were viewed as natural population control that reduced overcrowding and feeding costs. Women who survived these conditions for more than a few months were fundamentally transformed. Their bodies skeletal, their minds fractured by constant fear and deprivation. Contemporary accounts describe survivors as barely recognizable as the people they'd been there. Eyes hollow and distant, their hands trembling constantly, many talking to invisible companions or retreating into catatonic states where the horror of reality could no longer reach them. Eleanor Cobham survived her imprisonment, if you can call it survival. Released after performing public penance in November 1441, she was sent to various castles where she remained under house arrest until her death in 1452. The woman who emerged from those prison cells bore no resemblance to the proud duchess who'd been dragged through London's streets 15 months earlier. Contemporary chroniclers noted that she moved with the careful, broken submission of a beaten animal, spoke only when directly addressed, and seemed to exist in some distant place beyond the reach of human comfort or connection. She never spoke publicly about what happened behind those stone walls, but then again, she didn't need to. Her silence told the story more eloquently than words ever could. The machinery of medieval imprisonment for women wasn't about justice or rehabilitation. It was about erasure, the systematic destruction of women who threatened the established order by daring to have power, opinions, or autonomy. The methods were so effective that they echoed through centuries, influencing how society treated inconvenient women long after the last medieval prison cell was abandoned. Understanding this history isn't about dwelling in darkness, it's about recognizing how far we've come and remaining vigilant about how far we can still fall when society decides certain people do undeserve basic human dignity. These women suffered, but they also endured, and in remembering them, we honor not just their pain but their stubborn, extraordinary refusal to be completely erased from history. What strikes you most about these stories from the depths of medieval prisons? Is it the systematic cruelty, the economic exploitation, or the way entire societies participated in this machinery of suffering? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations about historical injustice help us recognize and resist similar patterns when they emerge in our own time.